There are crimes that happen in the open and crimes that happen in the quiet. No screams, no witnesses, no bodies discovered because the bodies were already supposed to be there. But in the winter of 2026, investigators in Pennsylvania say someone didn't just trespass into a cemetery. They didn't just vandalize stone. They allegedly went shopping. A crowbar, a burlap sack, and a cemetery so neglected, it became the perfect place to steal from the dead. And when police finally followed the trail, they say it didn't lead to a hidden grave. It led to a basement. Tonight, this is the 2026 grave robber case. The one prosecutors described like a horror film made real. But here's what makes this story worse. This wasn't a one-night impulse. Investigators say it was a pattern. Months of break-ins, damaged mausoleums, opened vaults, and remains taken from a historic cemetery with an estimated 150,000 grave sites. So the question isn't just who, it's how. How does a place meant to protect the dead become a marketplace? And how many families will never be able to prove what was taken from them? Stay with me, because the deeper you go, the quieter this story gets, and the more unsettling the silence becomes. Welcome back to Quiet Witness Chronicles. We don't chase ghosts here, we chase paperwork, timelines, patterns, the parts of the story people skip because they're uncomfortable. And this case is uncomfortable in a way that doesn't even feel real, because it's not about murder in the usual sense. It's about desecration, violation, the theft of identity from people who can't speak for themselves. Everything in this episode is based on reporting and public statements so far, and I'll be careful with language because this is an active case and allegations are still moving through the courts. Mount Moriah Cemetery, established in 1855. A massive burial ground near Philadelphia, sprawling, historic, and, by many accounts, neglected for years. Authorities and reporting describe it as effectively abandoned, with easy access points and no security fence at the time of the burglaries investigators were tracking. And that detail matters, because crime doesn't always begin with motive. Sometimes crime begins with opportunity. A cemetery is supposed to be one of the few places on earth where the rules are absolute. You don't take. You don't disturb. You don't enter to gain something. But investigators say this cemetery wasn't being protected like sacred ground. It was being treated like a forgotten lot. And in places like that, the living start acting like no one is watching. Police say the break-ins weren't a single event. They describe a string of forced entries and damage focused on mausoleums and sealed vaults. At least 26 mausoleums and vaults were reported forced open during the period investigators tracked. And this is where the story turns from random vandalism into something far more deliberate. Because mausoleums aren't easy. Vaults aren't easy. You don't stumble into that kind of access by accident. You plan. You bring tools. You return. And each return means one thing. The offender is getting more comfortable. Investigators would later describe a suspect allegedly leaving the cemetery with a crowbar and a burlap sack. Those two objects tell you almost everything you need to know about the mindset. A crowbar says force, not finesse. Not permission, just leverage. A burlap sack says, transport, something you can carry, something you can drop, something that doesn't look like a container until you decide it is. It's the language of theft, translated into a place where theft should be unthinkable. Local reporting citing court documents described a rope and carabiner set up in a way suggesting someone may have rappelled down into a mausoleum to reach underground crypt access, roughly a 10-foot descent. Let that sink in. This wasn't kids messing around. This wasn't a drunk stumble through a graveyard. If that detail holds through court, it suggests someone who came prepared and who treated a burial site like a structure to be breached, not a memorial, a target. When people hear grave robber, they picture a cartoon villain, a shovel in the moonlight, a laugh you can hear in the fog. But real cases like this don't run on theater. They run on routine. You don't do this once and stop. You do it until it feels normal. And according to investigators, this went on from early November through late December, a stretch of repeated incidents, not a single event. That timeline matters because it implies repetition, and repetition turns shock into process. Authorities said the investigation moved with the kind of unglamorous tools that solve most modern cases. License plate readers placing a vehicle repeatedly near the cemetery, and cell phone records that investigators said put the suspect in the area around the time of burglaries. It's not one clue. It's stacked clues. A pattern of presence. And in a case like this, pattern is everything, because the cemetery can't call 911. The dead can't report missing property. So the only voice the victims have is data. By the time investigators believed they understood what was happening inside the cemetery, they had a name. Jonathan Gerlach. Not a nickname. Not an alias. Not a figure hiding behind the internet. A man living a normal enough life that on paper didn't raise alarms. And that may be the most disturbing part. Based on court filings and reporting at the time of his arrest, Jonathan Gerlach was living in Pennsylvania in a residential setting that did not immediately stand out to neighbors or authorities. There were no public warnings, no prior headlines tying his name to violence, no indication, before this case, that he was being watched. He wasn't caught because someone suspected him. He was caught because investigators followed patterns. Patterns don't care who you are. Reporting describes a tip that raised the temperature of the investigation. A claim that someone had seen a partially decomposed corpse hanging in a basement and that the suspect had talked about selling a human skull. In most cases, tips are messy. They're emotional. They're half-formed. But sometimes a tip isn't meant to prove the whole story. It's meant to point the flashlight. And investigators followed it into social media. This is where the story becomes distinctly modern. Because investigators alleged the suspect's online presence intersected with groups centered on skeleton collecting and sales, and that there were signs of transactions, details that appear in reporting on search warrant contents. And if you've never thought about that world, the world where human remains become items, this case is your doorway into it. Not because we're going to sensationalize it, but because ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. A cemetery theft spree doesn't exist in a vacuum. It exists because someone believes there is value in what they're taking. Authorities say the arrest came after police observed the suspect leaving Mount Moriah with grave-robbing tools, then saw remains visible in the vehicle. And inside that burlap sack, police described an inventory so disturbing it barely sounds like a real sentence. Mummified children's remains, skulls, and bones. This is the moment where the cemetery case stops being about property damage and becomes a crisis. Because now it isn't, did someone break in? It's, how many people were taken? And, can they ever be returned? Investigators searched an Ephrata home and a storage unit tied to the suspect and reported recovering over 100 human skulls and other remains, including mummified body parts and more, along with jewelry believed linked to graves. A district attorney compared the scene to a horror movie. And here's the part that doesn't get enough attention. Even in a case with this much shock value, investigators still have to do slow work. Counting, cataloging, identifying. It's not dramatic. It's administrative. It's sacred. And it's brutal, because every item you catalog could belong to someone whose family is still alive. Authorities described finding around 100 sets of remains, while reporting also includes investigators saying the suspect admitted stealing about 30 sets and indicated grave sites. Those numbers can both exist in the same case because took about 30 can be an admission about specific theft events or locations. Found about 100 sets pieces can include partial remains, commingled remains, or recovered items not yet matched. This is the nightmare math of desecration, a human life reduced to a forensic counting problem. Prosecutors filed a stunning number of charges, reporting ranges around 574 to 575 counts, including abuse of a corpse, burglary, theft, desecration-related charges, and more. And this isn't prosecutors being dramatic. This is the legal system trying to measure harm when harm doesn't look like a single victim. It's trying to speak for dozens of families at once. As of mid-January 2026, reporting states the suspect remained held on $1 million bail, with a preliminary hearing reported around January 20th. And that matters for viewers because the story you're hearing tonight is not finished. It's moving, day by day, through court. The dead were violated, but the living are the ones who have to wake up and wonder, is it my grandmother? Is it my baby cousin? Is it my family plot? Because in a cemetery with tens of thousands of burials, identification isn't simple. And when remains are removed from their original context, when markers are disturbed, vaults breached, items moved, the chain of certainty snaps. This is what people don't realize. A cemetery isn't just memory. It's a map. And someone allegedly tore pieces of the map out. Reporting indicates investigators alleged online selling and social media links to collecting and sales, including references in warrant reporting. And if that's true, if any of this was profit-driven, then the grave robber isn't the whole story. Because a market requires buyers. A pipeline requires demand. And demand is the part of the story that never has a face because it hides behind usernames and private messages and collectors who tell themselves it's just a hobby. But this is the quiet truth. When humans become inventory, the line between curiosity and predation disappears. Here's what investigators are up against. Remains potentially spanning centuries. Multiple disturbed locations across a huge cemetery footprint. The possibility of commingling, remains moved, separated, stored. Even with modern forensics, this isn't a clean match the DNA moment. It's triage. It's trying to put dignity back together with evidence labels. After the arrest, reporting describes efforts to improve security, cameras, patrols, fencing, along with fundraising appeals. And it's tragic that it takes a case like this for resources to appear, because the people buried there have been owed protection for a long time. There's a phrase people use sometimes. They say a person dies twice. The first time, when their body stops. The second time, when their name is spoken for the last time. But this case introduces a third kind of death, a death that happens when your resting place is treated like storage, when your bones become objects, when your grave becomes an entry point, when the last boundary you had is forced open. And maybe that's why this story hits so deep, because it reminds us that the difference between civilization and chaos isn't technology. It isn't progress. It's respect. A cemetery is supposed to be proof that we don't just discard people when they're done living. It's proof that memory has weight. And if investigators are right, someone tried to turn that weight into a product. So now the living inherit the hardest job, putting the map back together, finding what was taken, returning names to the unnamed. And if you have family buried in places like this, places that have gone quiet, this case is your warning, not about ghosts, about gaps. Because when a community stops maintaining memory, someone else eventually decides what memory is worth. After the arrest, reporting describes efforts to improve security, cameras, patrols, fencing, along with fundraising appeals. And it's tragic that it takes a case like this for resources to appear, because the people buried there have been owed protection for a long time. If you want the follow-up episode the moment new court details drop, subscribe and keep notifications on. And tell me this in the comments, quietly, honestly. What do you think the real motive was here? Profit? Compulsion? Or something darker? The thrill of ownership? Because the dead can't testify. So the record belongs to the living. Good night. And keep your eyes open.